We asked, "What's the most downright creepy or unexplainable thing that you've ever experienced?" Sometimes you shouldn't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to. I was at a friend's house when I passed out on the couch, woke up a bit later and realized it was time for me to go. Got up and noticed my buddy's light on in his room, but the door was shut. I walked by the door and told him I was leaving because I had to work in the AM. He said, "Yep, see ya." Went to the fridge to grab my drink and walked back to his room and said, "Later, dude." He said, "Yup." Something did not seem legit. It did not sound quite like him, so I opened the door. No one's there. No one's in the house. Went for a walk outside and his truck was gone. I freaked the hell out, called his cell, and he had left to go to McDonald's 15 minutes prior. I bolted outside and waited for him to get home. He told me the kid that used to live there years ago hung himself in the attic, and ever since he lived there, he always noticed strange things and voices. This was confirmed by the neighbor as well. About just anyone who goes there has a weird experience. My buddy has dealt with it for years. When it gets weird, he yells out loud, "Leave me alone!" And he says the weird vibes stop for a bit, but they always come back. I work second shift, so I was up late watching TV after everyone else was in bed. Annie comes walking into the living room, half asleep. I say, "What's going on, Annie?" And she says, "My grandmother just called." I'm like, no one's called. She insists that she just talked to her grandmother and that her grandmother called to tell her goodbye, and now she wants to call her family to check on her. Nonsense, I say. It was just a dream. Don't bother your family in the middle of the night. Go back to bed and call them in the morning. And she goes back to bed. About an hour later, I'm just getting into sleep when the phone rings. "No," I whispered to myself. "Shit." And her family is calling to tell her that her grandmother died about an hour ago. The grandmother was old but not sick or on a deathbed or anything. Annie did not remember any of this the next day, and we never spoke of it. I thought about this for years and struggled with labeling it a ghost story or just an eerie coincidence. My skeptical and logical tendencies decided to label it a coincidence. The only time I've retold this story have been to people who do not know Annie, in situations where everyone's telling their ghost stories. Then, about a decade later, Annie dies unexpectedly. I went to her funeral and her brother delivered a eulogy. In it, he tells this story. When Annie was about 4, her great-grandmother died. All the family was gathered in the house and someone noticed that little Annie had disappeared. After a brief search, they found her in a bedroom rolling on the floor laughing. "What on earth are you laughing about, Annie?" And little Annie replies, "Great-grandma was tickling me. She came to tell me goodbye." Many years ago, as a 14-year-old, staying overnight at a friend's house with 3 other friends of similar ages. We'd all grown up together except one, who was a cousin of the kid who lived there, and we've never met him before. His older sister, 16 at the time, was the babysitter while the parents were out for the evening. She decides to unearth a Ouija board from a cupboard somewhere and thinks it'll be a laugh to scare us shitless. This was back in the day when you could buy a Ouija board as a board game from your local toy store. So we all gather around and she starts with the kind of yes-no lie detector, directing questions to each of us in turns. Cue nervous giggles. But we also felt unease as we all began to feel like this was awesomely amazing, like some kind of secret that we've all been unaware of before. Shit gets strange when the sister asked out loud, "If anybody is here, please show yourself." A pause of a few seconds, then a framed picture falls off the wall. Naturally, we all freak out. She calms us all down and insists we go back to the board because we have to help whoever knocked the picture down. Ashen-faced and hearts pounding, we start asking questions. And I should also add, the pointer is moving smoothly and rapidly in a completely different manner than before. "Are you in the room?" Pointer says yes. "Are you a man?" Pointer says no. "Do you need help?" Pointer says no. "What's your name?" Pointer spells out SARAH. H. Tell us a secret, we ask. The pointer spells out flip a coin, so we did. Someone leaves the table and gets a sparkling quarter from out of the loose change jar in the kitchen. This was in the days when quarters were big and chunky. The coin goes spinning and high up into the air. As we watch it coming down, it stops spinning and serenely falls edge down, landing on the table. When I say land, it did not bounce, it did not rock. It just came down and met the table perfectly balanced on its edges, as if someone reached out and gently placed it there. Breaking the silence, the pointer starts moving again, seemingly random letters when soon realized their initials, including middle names. A family tradition for my friend and his sister was to have 3 middle names, something not all of us knew. Aside from the brother and the cousin, no one else would have known the older sister's full name. And we'd met the cousin for the first time that night. Somehow, every person present had their initials correctly spelled out to them. The pointer pauses and then spells out the last 3 words. Children, stop, now. Took me many weeks to be able to sleep properly. No one told their parents, and over the years it became our collective shared secret. I could not rationalize it then, and I still cannot rationalize it now. Freaky as I live in the north of Switzerland. We have a lot of old military bunkers from the Second World War. When I was 7 or 8 years old, 3 friends of mine and I went out to explore one of these said bunkers, who was built on a hill inside of a small forest. The main door was jammed, so we had to break it up. We found a big log nearby and used it as a battering ram. After many tries, the door won't budge, but there was a peephole. It was about 10 centimeters or 4 inches in diameter. We opened it and illuminated the dark inside. There was a long, ruined and dark hallway with rooms on the left and right sides. We couldn't see the end of the hallway, it was just too long. Every one of us wanted to catch a glimpse inside when one of my friends says, "There's a small light at the end of the hallway." This light was not there when I watched through the peephole, so I pushed him away and took a second look. What I saw gave me a shiver. There was not a small light. It looked more like a flashlight pointed directly towards me, and behind it was a silhouette of a person. I walked a few steps back and said, "There's someone there." And at that said moment, someone or something knocked on the door from inside of the bunker. This was the moment we got into a panic, started screaming, and we ran away. I was so scared I ran straight home and locked the door. On the next day in school, my friends and I talked about the event. We came to the explanation that probably some older kids have played a prank on us. 1 week later, we went to the same bunker again, but as we saw, the welded connection that should have kept the door locked were rusty and not broken. We just left without saying a word to each other. It was impossible someone opened this door before us, and this was the only entrance. I still live in the same region, but since then, I've never visited that bunker again. I'm a skeptic. I'm the kind of guy who believes in what he sees and experiences. I did not believe in Santa when I was a child. I don't believe in the paranormal, but I can remember a few things that were unexplainable in my life. When I was really young, around 2 or 3 years old, I was always sick and quiet. Some things don't change. My parents moved us from Alaska to Oregon so they could be closer to family to help raise me. We moved around a few times, renting crappy old houses. There was one house we lived in particular that was old, creaky, the works. Even had an insane landlord, literally insane. She went to the hospital for psychotic and schizophrenic episodes, and her husband was trying to keep himself together while taking care of her, and trying to manage renting out the houses. What I'm saying is that it was not a happy place. My parents could feel it, my grandparents could feel it, and I could too. I told my parents there were skeletons in my closet watching me. When my grandmother was alone with me, I told her, "Man with the gun," and that's all I said. We were close to a city, so it would not have been anything normal to see a man with a gun around the house. Me saying small things like that persisted the entire time in the house. I never said anything about monsters or skeletons or ghosts, no time before or after that house. The weirdest part was about a month before we moved out. Someone broke into our home but did not steal or touch anything. There was human feces and urine smeared in weird patterns around the house and walls. Needless to say, we got the heck out of there to a different home. I have a couple stories about the next house. One was the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, and the other was a mix of scary/joy. Most terrifying moment, I was 6 or 7 when it happened, and it scared the piss out of me, so I can remember it very well. I was just starting to wake up at a night's rest, gaining my senses slowly. I was laying on my bed facing towards the door. I saw the door open and a large man walked in, who I assumed to be my dad. I remember a pressure on my legs that felt like hands, and they were shaking me lightly, as if trying to wake me up, but I decided to be a shithead that morning and pretended like I was still completely asleep. After a moment, the shaking stopped. Then, I felt a breeze under my blanket as if someone was lifting up the blankets by my feet. Right as I felt the chill, 2 large hands grabbed both of my legs, hard. They started pulling me off the bed as if trying to drag me underneath. This whole time, I thought it was my dad messing with me or just trying to wake me up, but the moment I felt those hands trying to pull me off the bed, I was terrified. I've never been scared of my dad. What was going on? Why did these hands feel so angry? I was clawing at my bed to get a grip on something to pull myself away from those hands. At some point, they just let go. After resisting 30 to 60 seconds, I ran out of the door in my room as soon as I was free. I ran to the kitchen and saw both of my parents standing there making breakfast. I was crying and confused. Even though my dad was standing in the kitchen, I asked him in between sobs something along the lines of, "Dad, why did you do that? You scared me and it hurt." He just looked at me flabbergasted and said, "I haven't been in your room to wake you up yet. Are you okay?" I think that was the most confused and scared I've ever been in my life. The last story I have is actually not so bad and kind of comforting. My little brother was born 4 years after me, and we already moved into the house that we still live in Oregon. My parents bought it from this sweet old widow who we'll call Trudy just for the sake of the story. This old woman was lonely, not any family close by, dead husband and only cats for companions. She took a liking to my then young parents and did everything she could to ward off the other buyers, and worked with my parents to make sure they got the house. She was lonely and trying to help a young couple with a small child, so we lived there for a couple years. My parents still keep in contact with Trudy. After 2 years or so, Trudy passed away. Now, my little brother has never met Trudy, and he was 2 or 3 when this happened. I remember him running out of his room after he had been put to bed to the living room very excited, saying to my parents that he visited Grandma Trudy, and she says hi. I was in an ambulance carrying me to the hospital in a small town towards the big hospital in the capital. I had bad pneumonia which was not responding well. It was due to the weak and old and not very effective oral antibiotics doctor were giving me. And the ambulance, I was choking, unable to breathe from what was later found to be 750 grams of fluids accumulated in my lungs. The ambulance was jolting, I was short of breath, and the next thing I remember was I felt a severe blow that kicked me out of my body. I later read stories by other people in similar near-dead situations who reported seeing a tunnel and a light, but this was not what I experienced. It was just a blow, a kick, which threw me out of my body. I was looking at my body from the side and also seeing a medical sister which was trying to put a breathing mask on my face. At first, I thought that something happened with my vision and I panicked. I was seeing everything in 2D like a movie screen, and almost nearly black and white. It was not completely black and white. It was like the colors were very darkened, as if everything was shades of gray with very little color in it. I know that it seems strange. I looked at my body from the side and yet I panicked for my eyes and vision. But that was what I thought then. I was 14 years old at the time and in a state of panic. I guess my logic was weak and weird at this moment. I severely panicked for my eyes and vision, and that was the moment when I thought of my mother. And in an instant I was looking at her. She was traveling together with my father and my uncle in a car, following the ambulance on the road to the capital. It was my uncle's car. I started talking to my mother, telling her that my eyes are not okay, that something happened to my eyes and I cannot see well. She did not hear me. They continued to talk, cursing and lambasting the incompetent doctors at Provincial Hospital, discussing how these doctors tried to coax them into sign papers after the ambulance left, how they refused to sign, and how they arranged for me to be admitted in the department led by an experienced and very competent doctor with a strange name, Professor Quanderleave. This was a unique name to which I remembered. At that point, the gravity of the situation hit me. I finally realized that something weird has happened, that I shall not be in this car, and I panicked even more. I began to think of my friends at school and the girl I liked, and as soon as I thought of someone who was really sharp enough in my mind, I don't know how to explain this in writing, but as soon as the thought about someone who was sharp enough, I instantly saw them as if I was standing next to that person in this very moment. Then the panic hit me harder. I started jumping from place to place, from memory to memory, at an ever-increasing pace. Everything became a kaleidoscope of people and places. This jumping from place to place abruptly stopped when an old lady came. She was very old, with white hair, white like complete snow white, not white like gray shadows or other colors I was seeing. She took me by the hand and insisted that I looked at her and repeated several times that I should calm my mind so that random jumping from place to place stops. I realized that she somehow was helping me to remain calm, to look only at her and set the rest to be quiet. Then she proceeded to explain that I'm going to fall asleep, and when I wake up I'll be at the hospital. She told me that doctors will start giving me injections, that some will be painful, but I shall be brave like a man and endure the pain, and that my condition is going to improve. But after 2 months, doctors will propose a surgery. She insisted several times that immediately when I wake up, I must tell my mother to refuse to sign papers for that surgery, to refuse to let them do the surgery. She told me that if they do the surgery, I'm going to die, and insisted again several times that I should explain this to my mother as soon as I wake up. She also told me that if I'm a good boy and do as she's told me, my uncle's going to bring me a lot of delicious chocolates in the hospital. So, long story short, I woke up to the ER, told everything to my mother. She was shocked by my detailed description of what they talked about in the car. I distinctly remember her eyes grew wide open when I told her the stranger's name of the doctor, and she listened to my frenetic demands from her to refuse to sign the paper for that damn surgery. She was not understanding what I'm talking about. At this moment, no one was talking about a surgery. My mother told me that everything's going to be okay, that there's not going to be any surgery, and genuinely tried to calm me down. I slept a lot in that hospital. I was so weak. Doctors drew up the fluids from my lungs using long and thick needles inserted through my back. It was indeed very painful. Christmas came and passed. They gave me strong antibiotic injections and I recovered 45 days later. They saw on x-rays one particular spot on my left lung which was refusing to heal. 2 months passed and it was still there, still the same size. On the next x-ray again, they proposed a surgery to remove this said spot. My mother resisted to tell them initially, but eventually, as time passed, there were many doctors insisting that surgery must be done, and my mother finally gave in to their pressure and signed the papers. However, this delayed the surgery for many weeks, and when they did a final x-ray before the surgery to see how big the spot is, it was gone, and the planned surgery was canceled. My mother and doctors lied to me. My mother was telling me there's not going to be a surgery, but they were actually secretly preparing to do it. I only later found out what really happened. My mother also told me how she watched, not believing her own eyes, how my extremely stingy uncle was bringing me chocolate after chocolate into the hospital. This happened in a then socialist country, Bulgaria. My uncle was working as a driver of a big truck for international transportation, and that was where he bought the chocolates. On our county local market, those chocolates were extremely expensive and nowhere to be found. and my uncle was and is, to some extent to this day, a very stingy man. My mother told me that, above all, this particular piece of my story convinced her to refuse signing surgery papers for so long, despite the intense pressure from the doctors. I lived in some really unsettling places. One of the events that stuck with me the most is probably this. I woke up one morning as usual. I walked into the mirror to brush the teeth and fix the hair. Now, I'm in a relatively small place with a balcony and a sink in the same room without opening windows. I looked in the mirror and I see one of my plants moving, like there's wind blowing against it. I turn around and walk over to the plant that's next to the door. I check the balcony, the door's closed. It was. For some reason, while walking back to the mirror, my eyes fell on one of the pins laying on my desk. When I arrive at the mirror, the first thing I notice are all the pins marking on my face. My heart stops and there's goosebumps everywhere. I cleaned up and fled the room. When I came back to the door, the balcony was open. Needless to say, I did not enjoy being there for quite some while afterwards. Waiting for my daughter's dance to finish down by Lake Ontario, I decided to go near the water's edge to check out the stars. I'm into amateur astronomy and looking over the lake and the darkest sky in my city. I'm looking at Orion and notice a very bright star about 20 degrees up due south. I thought it was a Sirius, except that night, Sirius was more southwest and about 40 degrees up in the sky. So, I'm thinking to myself, what the hell is that? It wasn't moving, so it wasn't the ISS. It's way too late to be Venus. Jupiter was high in the sky and Saturn was not in view. This thing was as bright as the International Space Station. Really bright. So, I'm wondering what it is when I hear a noise closer to me and notice a pure white coyote/wolf. It was walking along the water's edge. It's odd to see a coyote in the city, but not beyond expectations. It can happen. Since I was only about 20 feet from it, I decided it was better if the animal knew I was there, so I made a bit of noise. It had no reaction, so I made louder noises. Still no reaction at all. The thing did not even look at me. It continues along and I notice the star I've been watching a while ago go bright, and then suddenly fade to black. There was no clouds in the skies, and I'm a sailor, so I recognize a ship's light. It wasn't that. Perplexed, I turned my attention back to the wolf. It was gone too. The time was 12:30 a.m. I shook my head and dismissed it and all picked up my daughter and drove home. The next morning, which was Sunday, I was woken up to a phone call. It was my best friend's dad. He was crying. My best friend lived in Norway, which was a 6-hour difference, and passed away at 6:30 a.m. Oslo time in his sleep from a heart condition. After I hung up, I realized that my buddy died at the exact same time that I've seen that star and wolf. Then a big shiver went down my spine. It could be a really freaky coincidence, but it makes me feel good thinking my buddy was saying goodbye to me. I love you, Dave. I'd like to begin saying that there have been many happenings in this house, but I'll share the most frightening. Backstory. The area where my house is was once an open prairie, and we found Native American artifacts laying around the area. When my parents divorced when I was a young teenager, my mother and I moved into this house. Now, at first it seemed great. There was plenty of space and it had always a cozy feel to it. However, as time went on, strange things began to happen. The more I noticed them, the more frequent they would become. I'd hear someone walking downstairs as I was brushing my teeth. I would assume it was my mom, but whenever I checked, no one would be there. Footsteps began to be a very common sound in my house, especially at nighttime. So, after some time, I came to the realization that, oh shit, my house is haunted. Now here's where things get really weird. One day, my good friend and I just gotten done from being out in the sun and decided to retreat to my mom's house. Considering she'd be away on a business trip, we figured this would be awesome. My friend and I could go drink or do whatever mischievous activities we wanted to do. We were so wrong. We walked inside and headed straight for the basement where it was cooler than the rest of the house. While walking down the stairs, I noticed the Beatles' Yellow Submarine poster hanging at the bottom of the stairway was tilted slightly to the left. No bother, I figured. It must have gotten bumped by me or something. I fixed it and we walked into the main room. Mind you, we had pictures and posters hanging everywhere in the basement. What my friend and I saw instantly creeped us out. All 10 to 15 pictures on the wall were each slightly tilted to the left, just as the Beatles one had been. But the weirdness of the situation did not stop there. The storage room, essentially a dirt-floored room that's lifted about 4 feet off the ground, had its door cracked wide open. So, I walked over and see a golden glow emanting out. There's a pull cord light located about 10 feet from the door that's turned on. I hop up there into the storage room, crawl on my hands and knees to this light. I turn it off. Hoping that all of this had a natural explanation, I call my mom up and ask her about it. She says no idea what I'm talking about and has not been in the basement for weeks before she left on her trip. Shivers shoot down my spine. I look back into the storage room and the dirt there's a footprint. The most distorted and mangled footprint imaginable. I'm frozen in fear. My friend is as well. Without words, we look at each other, each feeling sickened, gut-wrenching quench. I slammed the storage space door shut and locked it, and we bolted out of my house as fast as we could. I'll never forget how sickening and mangled that footprint looked, and thinking that I crawled in there to turn off the light still gives me shivers to this day. I hope I could put a shiver on your spine with some of these truly daunting stories. Midnight Monster will give you your daily dose of adrenaline needed. Here, you will find the most gut-wrenching and mind-boggling experiences you've ever seen. Subscribe to the channel if you think you can stick around.